Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival, or as we like to call it, the VGBF. I am Phil Kaminsky, your VGBF host, and we miss you. We truly do. We miss hosting you in person, but we're so happy that you've chosen to spend your time with us virtually for this evening's watch party. Before we head into tonight's event, we would very much appreciate it if you would do 3 quick things for us. First, like this video. Second, leave a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. And third, please hit the subscribe bell so that you can receive notifications about all of our upcoming presentations and events. Also, we encourage you to support tonight's author by purchasing his book through independent bookseller and our partner, Politics and Prose. And very importantly, an extremely big thank you goes out to VGBF sponsors, the David and Mikhail Blair Family Foundation, Downtown Crown RPAI, and Montgomery College. Very good, very good. Let's get started. Tonight, we have with us Chief White House Correspondent Jonathan Karl to talk about his recent New York Times best-selling memoir, Front Row at the Trump Show. From a cub reporter at the New York Post to Chief White House Correspondent for ABC News, Jonathan has covered Donald Trump and the White House for a generation. Front Row at the Trump Show takes us inside the daily challenge of truthful reporting on the Trump White House, revealing what's at stake with vivid detail and deep insights. Jonathan regularly contributes to all ABC News broadcasts, including Good Morning America, World News Tonight with David Muir, and Nightline, all the while hosting his weekly podcast, Powerhouse Politics. Jonathan has covered every major beat in Washington, including the White House, Capitol Hill, the Pentagon, and the State Department. He has reported from the White House under 4 presidents and 12 press secretaries. In addition, Jonathan is president of the White House Correspondents Association. Interviewing Jonathan tonight is author and seasoned reporter Susan Page. Susan is the Washington bureau chief of USA Today. She has covered 6 White House administrations and 10 presidential elections. Furthermore, Susan has interviewed each of the past 9 presidents and has appeared as an analyst on PBS NewsHour, CBS's Face the Nation, Fox News Sunday, NBC's Meet the Press, CNN's State of the Union, and many, many more. Her upcoming book entitled Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi and the Tests of Power will be published early next year. Welcome, Jonathan and Susan.
Hey, Phil, thanks so much. It's so great to be with you and such a pleasure to be back at the wonderful Gaithersburg Book Festival, which has such terrific authors and such wonderful readers. I know John is glad to be here too.
Absolutely. It's an honor to be here. I wish we were here in person, but I'm glad that we're here virtually. And thank you, Susan, for doing this.
You know, the opening words of your book, Jonathan, even before the introduction, describe the first time you met Donald Trump. Tell us about that.
Well, it's really, I mean, even if we weren't where we are today, this is a remarkable story. And it's one that I've thought about a lot over the past 4 or 5 years as all the subsequent events have unfolded. But what happened is I was in New York City, a very junior reporter for the New York Post, which was basically the number 4 daily newspaper in New York. And I was an aspiring political reporter. I'd been at the paper for just a few months. And I'd worked my way up to be basically like the number 3 person at City Hall. You know, out of like 3. So, you know, that was my gig. And a story had just broken in New York that had basically riveted the attention of the entire city, probably with the exception of me. I didn't care much about it, but I knew that my editors cared about basically nothing else. The story was that Michael Jackson, at the peak of his popularity as the king of pop, had just secretly married Lisa Marie Presley, the daughter of Elvis. And this was, you know, the king of rock, the daughter of the king of rock and the king of pop coming together. And they were said to be staying at Trump Tower. Nobody had seen the couple in public yet. This was a secret matrimony that had happened sometime earlier and just been revealed. So I wanted to get a story in the paper that day, you know? I mean, I wanted to, and the new mayor, his name was, you probably heard of the guy, Rudy Giuliani. There was nothing going on at City Hall that was going to get me in the newspaper the next day. So I wanted to see what I could do. So on a whim, I called up Donald Trump. Now, I didn't know Donald Trump. I had never met him. I'd obviously, knew about him. I didn't have his phone number, so I had to look in the phone book for the general number for the Trump organization, which I did. And I this was just like a whim. This was just throwing, so I didn't even know exactly what I would say. Like why? So anyway, so I called and I asked to talk to Donald Trump, and the operator put me through to his secretary, his gatekeeper, a woman named Norma Federer, who died a few years ago, but a absolute, almost a member of the Trump family. And she was like, "What do you want to talk to him about?" And I said, "Well, I've got a story to pitch to him." And I'm thinking quick, like what's going to capture Donald Trump's imagination? So I said, the story is, why would the most famous newlyweds on the planet start their honeymoon at Trump Tower? And I got a call back from Donald Trump within, less than an hour. And he said he just invited me up to Trump Tower, which was amazing because because of the story and all the interest it had generated, all the paparazzi, all the camera crews, all the fans, all the whole area around Trump Tower had been cordoned off by the police because there were so many people trying to catch a glimpse. So I just went in, got to go right into the lobby, get on the elevator, go up to Trump's office on the 26th floor, and that's where I met Donald Trump. And I brought a photographer with me. His name is Francis Spector at the New York Post. And we spent the next, hour or so running around Trump Tower. And Trump was like a salesman. He was like telling me how great his building is. Well, of course they're here. Look at this. And he showed me where they were staying. He introduced me to Michael's bodyguards. He showed me the secret, tunnels down in the basement of Trump Tower where they could leave without being spotted by all those people outside. He even told me where all the other famous people, and by the way, through most of this, he was a source in the Trump organization. That was the attribution I was allowed to use. He showed me where they all lived. So Sophia Loren is on this floor. The British royal family has an apartment over here. Andrew Lloyd Webber, Steven Spielberg. And the Post, I had my first cover story, my exclusive, this was the big raging headline, inside the honeymoon nest or whatever it was. And then there were 4 or 5 stories on the inside. On the inside, it was very funny. One of the things that they published was a graphic of Trump Tower with arrows pointing to where all of the famous people, who I'm sure were trying to be a little indiscreet, exactly where their apartments were. But that's where I met Trump. And Susan, as you know from holding the book in your hand there's a photograph actually that was taken while he was giving me that tour. And it's a very interesting thing because he suddenly stopped mid-tour. We were up in his apartment on the 68th floor.
Here's the photo.
There it is. We were up on, and there's the article on the right. So we were, he suddenly stopped and said, "Do you want to get a picture?" And my photographer had been taking pictures all along, so I didn't really know what he meant at first. And then it hit me, oh, he means like a picture with me and him. Which I'm a reporter. We don't usually stop and say, "Hey, pose with the guy you're doing a story on." But nevertheless, that photo was taken. I had it when I was in New York, and then I eventually, a couple years later, moved to Washington D.C. The photo went in a box. It was in a little frame. It went in a box of photographs. I hadn't thought of that picture at all until he became president. And I went frantically trying to find it in boxes of old photographs, and I found it. And it's amazing how he doesn't look any different. I don't think.
And you also look exactly the same as 1994. Neither of you have changed a bit. So does of course you remember this story. Does Donald Trump remember this story about the first time he met you?
Yes, he does. I know this because when I interviewed him many years later, I brought it up with him. You remember when he was at the White House Correspondents dinner in 2011, the famous one where Obama made fun of him relentlessly. I talked to him with him a little bit about it then, and then in 2013, his very first political trip of that cycle, I ended up interviewing him in Iowa 2 years before he came down the escalator and announced his campaign. And his lone political, he didn't mention it, he didn't mention it all, but his lone political operative at that point told me that Trump had that story and brought it up to him and had it like you know, in a picture frame, the cover of it. So I know he loved it.
You know what? It was great for both of you.
Yeah.
You got the cover of the paper and he got the cover of the paper. And so it suited everybody's interest except possibly Michael Jackson's.
I mean, and all the famous people that had apartments in Trump Tower that might not have wanted the world to know exactly where they lived.
It's possible.
But no, I think, you know, what I think it did, and it actually ends up being instructive for all that happened since, because his motive, his modus of operations is really the same. The reason why he called me back, an absolute unknown reporter, with no track record as far as he was concerned, he didn't know what he was getting into, is I gave him the opportunity to make Donald Trump the center of a massive story, which up till that point, he was only a bit mentioned. You know, they were staying in Trump Tower. And then this became a story about Donald Trump, almost more than it was a story about Lisa Marie and Michael Jackson.
You know, here's something that really struck me by book. So this is the opening anecdote in your book. And you go to the end of the book, and it's like more than 300 pages long. You go to the end of the book, and there's another scene where you've been summoned to Trump's office. It's now a quarter of a century later. He is the president of the United States. And the scene is not so unfamiliar to the time you met him in 1994. Tell us about that last occasion that you describe in the book of being called to the Oval Office to talk to him.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I was able to write about in the book that it was a story I had not told yet, and it's I have to tell you, I'll tell you exactly what it was, but one thing I want to say is that as I was sitting with him in the Oval Office across from the Resolute desk, the image of that picture kept on flashing in my brain because I had been going through it. I was in the process of writing the book. I was going through it. I was like, oh my God, this is the same guy. This feels like the same event, except we're not on the 26th floor of Trump Tower. We are in the Oval Office. And we're not talking about where Sophia Loren has her apartment. We're talking about, you know, the fate of the world. I mean, but it's the same guy. So what happened is, and by the way, this was a gift, because one of the biggest challenges in writing this book was figuring out how to end it, which I did not know as I was writing. I did not know where the book ultimately was going to take me. And this gave me just a beautiful way to kind of put a coda on the book. I had done a story on Labor Day of last year, and it was you know, Susan, when we do stories where not much news has happened, and a Labor Day is like an often like that, and so we have kind of a kitchen, we call it the kitchen sink story. It's like the president did this, and then he did that, and there was this, and then you know, and you put it in the middle of the paper somewhere. Well, we do that in TV too. So this was like a kitchen sink story. It ran deep in the broadcast because there wasn't really much news, and Donald Trump had done a few things that day, and I basically, you know, summarized what he had done. It was a very simple story. He had gone to FEMA because there was a hurricane coming in on Florida, and you know, approaching Florida. So he went to get a briefing about the hurricane. And while he was there, he took some questions from the press, and he answered some questions about gun control, because this was not long after the shootings in El Paso and Dayton. And he made a bit of news because he seemed to suggest that improving background checks was not really a priority, which previously he had said it was. So this was like, you know, he's going back and forth on his position on guns. So that was kind of the lead of the piece. And he'd played golf earlier, and CNN had gotten pictures of him playing golf. So he played golf, he went to FEMA, he made some comments on guns. And oh, by the way, and this is like at the end of my piece, he said that the hurricane was headed towards Alabama. And then the National Weather Service tweeted, their office in Birmingham, that no, Hurricane Dorian is not going to Alabama. So I mentioned this in the piece. and it apparently infuriated him. I knew it infuriated him actually because he tweeted about it not long after the piece ran. Now I'm amazed that on Labor Day, with a hurricane approaching and all the other things going on, that he actually took the time to watch World News Tonight and all the way in until my piece and paid enough attention to, anyway, so that kind of blew me away. But he tweeted at me and called me a, I want to say third rate, but that was later. He didn't call me a third rate. What?
Was it lightweight?
Lightweight. He called me a lightweight reporter. Yes, he called me a lightweight reporter. But the first time he tweeted, he used the wrong Twitter handle, and he spelled Jonathan with an H. And some poor Baptist minister in Kentucky got the, you know, all that we get when something like that happens, all the trolls and all the, right, you're terrible. So the poor Baptist minister said, you know, sorry, it wasn't me. I think you meant, so he tweeted again with my Twitter handle. That, by the way, that's a whole nother, that Baptist minister became a little bit of a player in all of this. But so anyway, that was Labor Day. So Tuesday, the following day, I got summoned to the White House quite by surprise. I was actually in a meeting with Mick Mulvaney and the press secretary, Stephanie Grisham, with a couple of my colleagues on the board of the White House Correspondents Association. And suddenly Mulvaney stopped and said, actually, the boss wants to see you. So I had no warning whatsoever that this was happening, which is very similar to the New York 1994 event too, because when he called me, I mean, first of all, I didn't know if I'd get a call back, and I didn't know he'd say, come now. I mean, it's like, you know, there's no time to prepare for any of this stuff. So they brought us into the Oval Office, and Susan, you've been in there many times. I don't know if there's anybody alive who has interviewed as many presidents as you have, but you know that every time you walk in that place, you are a bit in awe of the surroundings, and you think about all that has happened in that office. But this was something very strange because Mulvaney and Grisham brought us into the Oval Office, me and my two colleagues, Zeke Miller and Steve Portnoy, on the White House Correspondents Association board, and then said, just wait a minute, we'll go get them. And they left us, and they closed the door, and they left us alone in the Oval Office. I mean, there's no Secret Service, there's no aid, there's nothing. And we're just looking around, sitting across from the desk, and we're thinking, this has got to be a test, right? I mean, they're definitely, somebody's watching. They want to see what we're going to do. And it felt forever. I mean, it was a matter of a couple of minutes, but it felt like it was going on forever. Finally, he walks in, and he spent about 45 minutes with us. And at first, he just small talk about the White House Correspondents Association dinner that he went to in 2011. And then he got to the meat of it, and he lashed out at me. And forgive my language, but he said, your bullshit hurricane story, your bullshit hurricane report. And this was da-da-da. And I'm like, so I said, sir, all I did was report what you said and what the National Weather Service said. That's really, that's all, but thank you. And what I didn't know, so it was a surreal meeting. I describe it in the book. It goes through, you know, he goes into topic after topic, and it's really quite a performance. But that began the week of Sharpiegate because he did not let go of that hurricane story. I was the first one to mention it on network news. It had gotten some attention on the cables, but it hadn't really blown up into a huge thing until he started, you know, screaming about it and insisting that he was right and the Weather Service was wrong about where this hurricane was going. And, you know, and it culminated a couple of days later in the Oval Office when he took out the Sharpie pen and put the cone in the hurricane. Anyway, so that whole time, I'm telling you, Susan, I was thinking, this is exactly the same guy that I was with in Trump Tower 25 years ago. Exactly the same guy.
Yeah, that's what struck me too. You know, all presidents hate the press, right? And why wouldn't they? We just spend our whole time trying to hold them to account, find when they've made mistakes, spotlight stories that we think are important and they think are unfair. But this has been a particularly fraught relationship with this particular president. Let me ask you first about the attitude of reporters, mainstream news reporters, toward the president. Do you think that the coverage has generally been pretty fair? Or do you think there is grounds for criticism for how the mainstream press has covered President Trump?
I think there is grounds for criticism, but I mean, I think there's grounds for criticism of any president. I think that some self-reflection is helpful. Every president, as you have pointed out, thinks that the coverage of their administration is too negative and misses the important stuff, and they don't get credit for the things that they should get credit for. It's just with Trump, it's to an entirely different level, and it comes with a vilification of the very idea of news gathering and the very idea of the role of an independent press. And he came in defining the press. I don't think Donald Trump is particularly strategic about anything. He as he once said, I write in the book, in an interview with Barbara Walters in 1987, he was asked for what his big plan is, and he said he doesn't really have one. He's like, he believes like the prize fighters. When you get in the ring, you go with the punches. You can't plan, two lefts, one. You have to go with the punches, and that's the way he is. But he is strategic to this degree about his criticism of the press. He calls the press, borrowing the phrase that Steve Bannon coined, the opposition party. And he believes that if he can define the press as the opposition party, as basically like the Democrats, then people will take the press coverage less seriously. It becomes more like a partisan attack than an objective news story. So it has less sting if it's negative about him. So he's strategic about that. And I think that with Trump, there is so much to be outraged about as a reporter. And I'm not talking about political views and what he does. I mean, but I'm talking about his disregard for the truth. My friend Glenn Kessler at the Washington Post is, started the fact checker brand before Trump came along, kind of, the system of giving Pinocchios for statements of public officials and the like. And Kessler and his team have documented thousands and thousands of lies, inaccuracies, untruths, however you want to label them, that have come from Donald Trump. And, so there's a lot to be outraged. He calls what we do, he calls us the enemy of the people. He insults individual reporters. So just even away from, aside from the policies and the self-imposed and the self-created crises that we've seen over the last 3.5 years, there's a lot to be outraged about. And what I think, and this is more of a general tone in like a specific criticism, if you look at the coverage of Donald Trump over the past 3.5 years, it has been relentlessly negative. Now there's plenty of material to be negative about, but it has been almost always at the same level of outrage. And I think it's made it hard to distinguish between real scandals and scandals that aren't really all that big a deal. So for instance, Hurricane Gate, Sharpie Gate. Come on. Who cares that he mentioned that Alabama was going to be in the path? You could get all serious. Well, this is about, people have to prepare for a hurricane, but it wasn't like people in Alabama were hiding in their basements because Trump said that the hurricane might come there. It didn't really matter. But if you had tuned into any of the cable channels, or 2 of the 3, over that week, you would have thought that like we had just invaded Iraq again, and there were no weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't that big a deal. Now he made it that way by like continuing to tell untruths about his own state. Yes, so he contributes to this, but we've, I think, too often have played along, and people get tired and weary, and then when you've got something real like what's going on now, people's views are all kind of locked in place already.
Yeah. And you make the point in your book that if the press always takes the bait, it does not serve the interests of the press in terms of like having credibility, breaking through to people, not, that it's often not in our interest to take the most out, to get to be the most outraged possible in every circumstance. You know, one of the huge privileges of covering the White House is that you're there when big things happen. Sometimes you don't even know it's going to be a big thing, and it turns out to be something that's really important. There was a date you were in the Oval Office, November 10th, 2016. President-elect Trump comes to visit President Obama. You were in the room. Tell us about that.
There are moments, I mean, our job is to kind of witness history and to write the rough draft. But there are moments when you really feel that something is happening that is historic, and that the world in some way will not be the same after it is done. And this was 2 days after the presidential election. And Donald Trump was meeting with President Barack Obama. And it was the first time these two men had ever met. They had been in the same room together at that White House Correspondents' Dinner, but they did not meet. So it's the first time. And they had been these two players in this drama that had gone back far before Trump's presidential campaign. I mean, there was the whole birther nonsense and all of that, which was led by Donald Trump. But here, Donald Trump had just won this, perhaps the greatest upset in American political history. And it was such an upset that it surprised everybody. It surprised everybody that worked at that White House for Barack Obama. I think it surprised everybody that was working at the campaign headquarters in Trump Tower for Donald Trump. And it certainly surprised Hillary Clinton, and surprised us, those of us covering it, you and I and everybody else. But it happened, and here it was. We were all still bleary and sleepy-eyed. I'd been in New York for for our election night coverage and the aftermath, and it was announced that he was going to be making this trip. So I raced down to DC, and I'll just never forget. First of all, we were told it was going to be a short meeting, 15 minutes or so, certainly no more than 30. And at the 15-minute mark, I was in the pool. So, one thing I try to do in the book is explain how we cover the White House, so you can kind of get a sense. We use terms, you and I, because we've been steeped in this, and this has been what we've done for so long. But basically, anytime the president has an event in the Oval Office or in the cabinet room, or one of those small rooms they're all small rooms in the West Wing, there are reporters there to witness it, but you can't fit the entire press corps in, so we have a pool. So there's one television correspondent. There are a few reporters for the wires, usually a newspaper reporter, a radio reporter, and some cameras, and that's like it. It's a small group. It's basically the same group that flies on Air Force One, and we take turns. So there are 5 television networks. So we're in there 1 out of every 5 days, and our job is to represent all 5. We do a pool report, which means it's shared by everybody. It's pooled. So the pool gets called by the Obama press office to come and go into the Oval Office. So we assemble and we go into the colonnade, the iconic colonnade by the Rose Garden, to wait to go into the Oval Office. And we wait, and we wait, and we wait. And usually, no president wants a bunch of reporters waiting outside the door to his office. So usually we're called and then we're brought right in, maybe 2 minutes, and we're brought right in. But in this case, we're waiting and we're waiting, and I'm looking around. And keep in mind that there are only 2 people in this meeting, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. So everybody else, the group of people that Donald Trump had brought to the White House, which included Jared Kushner, Hope Hicks, Dan Scavino, Keith Schiller. It was like all this kind of like core group from the beginning of the campaign were basically wandering around. Kushner was walking around the South Lawn with Dennis McDonough, Obama's chief of staff, and Hope and Scavino and Schiller were off on the other part of the colonnade posing for photographs, and then they went and waited inside in the cabinet room. They're like tourists. It was amazing. And we waited and we waited and we waited for about 45 minutes. and were finally brought in. So they had been in there about an hour alone, way longer than expected. And I have on my phone, Susan, I because of the history of this, I rolled a video on my phone as we were walking into the Oval Office. And it's a remarkable thing. It's one of those things that I recorded and didn't look back on until I was writing this book. But it's just amazing to see that, the jostling, the chaos to get in, to get positioned to where you're going to be. I was right by the couch. I was maybe 5 or 6 feet away from Trump, and even closer to Obama, like basically right next to Obama, by that couch. And the thing that struck me about being in that room, that Oval Office, it was the first time that I had been in a room where Donald Trump was not in charge. This was Obama's meeting. He had called the meeting. It was Obama who called the press in. It was Obama who said, okay, everybody settle down, okay, and who opened up with the remarks and then invited Trump to make his own. And, Trump's always the center of attention and always the one calling the shots. This was Obama's show. And the other thing that struck me is I looked at him, and I've looked at these photographs because I took a bunch of photos myself just to see if my perception was right, because this is what I wrote in my notes. I kept a very detailed journal throughout all of this, which became the raw material for the book. What I wrote is that he seemed humbled to me. I'm talking about Donald Trump. That Donald Trump seemed humbled.
Not a word usually associated with Donald.
Not before and not since. That he seemed in his hunched over, the look in his eyes, he seemed a little bit like he was taking in the surroundings of that incredible office, and had realized the magnitude of what he was about to inherit. And that he seemed a little freaked out, I think is how I actually worded it to myself in my journal. And I look back at the photos and I stand by it entirely. This was a different Donald Trump. And I thought that this was, and he said amazingly nice things about Barack Obama when it came his time to speak. And later that night, he tweeted something nice about Barack Obama and said, Michelle was great too. And it was like he had just realized that this is real. It was happening, and it was serious. And then within 24 hours, we were back to normal. But it was a remarkable moment. And one thing I did in writing the book was go back and talk to everybody who was there that day and spend time with either Trump or Obama to try to get to cull whatever I could about what happened during that meeting and in the atmospherics around that meeting.
It's interesting because that meeting seemed relatively, it was certainly in a respectful in the traditional way that we have seen leaders from the two parties deal with one another. I think President Obama was respectful toward Trump, and Trump was respectful back. And yet now we're in a situation where President Trump is accusing Barack Obama of terrible crimes, of Obamagate, of trying to undermine the duly elected president to succeed him. Do you understand what has gone on in that relationship? I mean, this is mostly, I think, in President Trump's attitude toward President Obama that seems to be so fierce. Why is that? I
think that it's driven in part by a sense of paranoia about the people. As you know, when a new president comes in and brings in, his or her staff, you have your political appointees, you've got your, all the kind of high profile positions, but there are a lot of people that serve from one administration to the next. The National Security Council, for instance, is populated by a lot of career public servants. And that's true. I mean, it's true of the people that kind of make the White House run. And these are not non-political people. But as Donald Trump came in, he felt he was surrounded by enemies. I mean, we call it like they call it the deep state. I mean, I don't want to like use a loaded term like that, but he did have people around him who had worked for Obama. And so that's one fact, and that's not unusual. That's the way our government works. It's one of the really nice things about our government is that, you know, we have a very effective transition of power. No matter how contentious a presidential election is, you know, people get back to work. But over the course of those first several weeks, you had some extraordinary leaks. And I don't mean the kind of petty leaks about, oh, you know, Bannon said this or da da da. I mean the leaks of and I document some of it. I get into some detail about some of this, but like conversations that the president had with foreign leaders, like the Prime Minister of Australia, the President of Mexico, the transcripts, the actual full transcripts of those conversations actually were reprinted in the Washington Post. I've never seen something like that. And, you know, because the president's got to be able to have a confidential conversation with another world leader. And so it had to be leaked by somebody. And there were things like that. And in Trump's mind, there are these like people all around, these Obama people that are trying to undermine him, and they're still there, even though he won. They're still there. They're still around him. You know, I mean, for a while he still had Obama's Attorney General. I mean, you know, Sal Yates, and it very quickly became a thing where he thought that everybody was out to get him, and Obama was orchestrating all of it. I think that's driven a lot of it.
It's been remarkable. You know, you wrote your book before the COVID-19 pandemic, but I wonder if it has it changed your assessment of President Trump or deepened your understanding of President Trump? Has it changed anything to watch him operate during this terrible and deadly crisis?
I think that in a very odd way, the book actually, the timing was perfect, because I think that what we've seen play out in this pandemic, that this is the first real external crisis of the Trump presidency, the first crisis that was not created by his own actions or the actions of his own people. It's an external crisis. And he has operated in a way, from the way he has communicated to the way he has managed to the way his advisors have worked, in a way that is exactly what I was trying to get at in this book, and almost in technicolor. I mean, you know, he's actually like the reason why I called it Front Row the Trump Show is because he sees his presidency, I firmly believe, as a show. Now, it's not to say he doesn't care about the people, he doesn't have things he wants to do, but it is a show first and foremost. He reads the reviews, he reads the critics, he beats up the critics, he courts the critics, he tracks the ratings and the crowd sizes and all that. This is what the way you would if you just launched a Broadway show. He's like, it's exactly the way he operates. And we've seen him, you know, unveil these coronavirus press briefings, which for a while were a daily occurrence. It's like the Trump show really started, like as my book came out, we finally saw literally the Trump show. And he, not to sound crass about it, it was the president himself who started talking about his highly rated coronavirus briefings, and, you know, more, you know, better rating than the season finale of The Bachelor and stuff. I mean, who talks like this? But that is exactly in keeping with what I was writing about how he operates. And then it's also the ways the people around him have operated. You know, there was, I think, a resistance within the Trump administration that, you know, was probably was about coming to an end when the op-ed was covered and was printed in the New York Times. And now you're at a point, I mean, I write about Mick Mulvaney when he becomes acting chief of staff, assigning, you know, telling the senior advisors in the West Wing to read a book called A First-Rate Madness, and reading passages of it at an event he had at, you know, retreat he had at Camp David, making the case that mentally ill leaders in history have often been better than sane ones. And, the message to me of that was Trump, from the acting chief of staff, is Trump may be crazy, or you may think he's crazy, but his crazy may be a lot smarter than your, perfectly rational views, because crazy's worked in history. So, I mean, it's like nobody's been trying to stop him. Nobody's been trying to channel him. And this has been, Trump's instincts, Trump's, it's been entirely the Trump show.
So Kirkus Reviews called your book, quote, a valuable report from the scene of an ongoing train wreck, unquote. What kind of reviews has your book gotten from President Trump?
Well, that was a really funny thing, because I over the last few weeks, I had two different members of Congress reach out to me. One sent me a text message. This member is Republican, had just met with Trump the day before, and he wanted me to know that a copy of my book was on the Resolute, was on the president's desk. I was like, wow, that's kind of interesting. So somebody's given it to him, I guess. He's at least seen the cover. We don't know if he's read it, but it's there. And as you know, the Resolute is not a very cluttered desk in the Trump White House. It's generally completely empty. So the fact that my book was there, that was a level of prominence that surprised me. So, and then a week later, I got a call from another prominent member of Congress who had just had lunch with Trump, who let me know that Trump's got a study off the Oval Office where he has lunch and he has television screens and where he spends a lot of his time. To let me know that when they had lunch, my book was in the president's study. So I knew that he had it. And then just a little over a week ago, he was having a big event in the state dining room at the White House with his top economic advisors and a bunch of Republican members of Congress. And I asked him a few questions. I was in the pool that day. And in the middle of it, he suddenly started talking about my book. I mean, it's like they're all assembled. There's Mnuchin, there's Kudlow, there's Kushner, there's Kevin McCarthy's over here, and it's like, and he's talking, and he takes a little time to. It was better than I thought it would be. He told me it was better than I thought it would be, and I mean about me. I thought you were actually, you were pretty good to me. Now this is a book in which I say that Donald Trump is waging a war on truth that ultimately may threaten American democracy. But he thought that the book was good about him, or better than he thought it would be about him. And then he asked me how it's doing. And Susan, you've been in many pool sprays over the years. Again, this is not about us. I felt really uncomfortable. So I just said one word. I just said bestseller. And then he's like, which definitely played into him. So he was like, oh yeah. It's like, well, congratulations. I told you it was a good book. So I don't know. I don't know how much of it he actually read, but I did. There's a serious thing in there. Although at the end of the book, I make a pretty dire assessment about what what I call his war on truth has done to our country and what it could do to our country in terms of lasting damage. I did write this book with the intention of explaining what had happened and what it's been like. Susan, I want somebody like 20 years from now or 50 years from now who wants to know what was that Trump thing all about. I'm hoping that somebody would hand him my book and say, well, this gives you a sense without judgment. I mean, this is how it played out. I mean, I don't shy away from pointing out anything, but it's not a polemic. It's a story. It's a story. And I want people to understand what it's been like to know him the way I've known him, and to see this journey and to be there, to be vilified by him, to be attacked by him, and occasionally praised by him while I'm all trying to do my job and keep me out of it. I wanted to tell that story because I think it's a pretty remarkable story.
Well, we're just about out of time, Jonathan. The President Trump thought it was a pretty good book, better than he expected. I thought it was an excellent book. It was both smart and also kind of delicious. So congratulations on front row at the Trump show, and it's been a pleasure to be able to talk with you about it here at the Gaithersburg Book Festival.
Great. Thank you, Susan. It's an honor to spend some time with you. I'm a huge, huge fan, and you're a very good friend. So I appreciate you taking time to do this. And thank you to the Gaithersburg Book Festival. It's a great event, and it's been an honor to be here.
Jonathan and Susan, that was just a fantastic interview. I want to thank you both for taking the time to be with us here tonight.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank all of you for being with us for this week's Saturday night premiere. I'm certain that you'd enjoy picking up your copy of Front Row at the Trump Show, which you can do right now by visiting our partner, independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. Just click on the link that we have in the description box below to order your copy. In conclusion, we've got a wealth of terrific author presentations coming up over the next 2 weeks. Tomorrow morning, children can tune in at 11 a.m. for a fun and engaging 45 minutes with author Adam Gidwitz. And be sure to join us next Friday evening at 5:30 p.m. for a live interview that we've got with Ruth Marcus, author of Supreme Ambition, Brett Kavanaugh, and the Conservative Takeover. Saturday night at 7 p.m., join us for a conversation between psychological suspense authors Sarah Pekkanen and Kate White as they discuss their latest books, You Are Not Alone and Have You Seen Me? Each presentation will be accessible right here on the VGBF YouTube channel, so make sure to hit that subscribe bell for notifications. For a full list of VGBF programming, visit GaithersburgBookFestival.org. Until then, my friends, I've been your VGBF host, Phil Kaminsky. Have a great evening, and as always, keep reading.